First, those 30,000 new pages. That's how many pages came out today. The Justice Department released from their Epstein file the prosecution files. Those documents were shared on the Justice Department's X account. DOJ included this statement, quote, "Some of these documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. To be clear, the claims are unfounded and false, and if they had a shred of credibility, they certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already," end quote. So, what's in today's released documents? Well, one email from an unidentified Manhattan federal prosecutor says Trump had flown on Epstein's private jet more times than previously reported. The email, which dates back to January 2020, says Trump flew on Epstein's jet 8 times between 1993 and 1996. Documents also show Manhattan federal prosecutors subpoenaed employment records from Mar-a-Lago back in 2021. The subpoena asked for records connected to the investigation into Ghislaine Maxwell. Former federal prosecutor Joseph Moreno joins me. And nice to see you, Joe. And big deal if someone was on an airplane 8 times, 10 times, 30 times, or 40 times, unless you did something wrong.
Greta, I know I've beaten this drum for months now, maybe even years with regards to this story, but this is why we don't release investigative files. They are explosive. They can be embarrassing. They can create all kinds of innuendo. But if someone's not charged, either because the innuendo or the evidence wasn't there, or there was some evidence, but there wasn't enough to prosecute and get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, well, then those investigatives stay sealed.
This is a little different in terms of, I agree with you for the most part, but transparency becomes very important when this becomes sort of the talk of the internet. And so it's like, even if he didn't do anything wrong at all, it's sort of like, by omission, everyone's going to sort of fill that vacuum and think he did something wrong. So in some ways, I think that it's actually good to get it all out there. And I at first thought that this was a story that was not, didn't find the least bit interesting. Now I do.
Well, but where does it end? I mean, like, what happens if the next sensational story about some famous person is, either is not tried, as an investigation that doesn't go to trial, or it goes to trial and they don't get a conviction? Do we still release the files? Like, there's an outcry to see this stuff. Are we setting a precedent here?
But aren't a lot of people out there, Republicans, calling on the internet former President Clinton a pedophile? And they're calling President Trump, current president, a pedophile. And, of course, with Trump's history with a young woman who was of age, naturally it's just ammunition for more. And while he had bad behavior with Monica Lewinsky, it doesn't necessarily mean he had bad behavior here. And, in fact, there's nothing so far to show it.
I'm second to none in my desire to prosecute wrongdoing, particularly pedophiles or crimes against women, crimes against children. But you don't use that word against someone who hasn't been convicted, right? That's just mudslinging. And so whether it's against Bill Clinton or whether against President Trump, politics don't matter. But the Justice Department providing this information to the public, now you have things like that, things like people calling names, things that calling people things that.
You don't think that would have happened if it weren't released? Because I think a lot of people, a lot of Trump's enemies had all sorts of crazy ideas about what he was doing, just terrible things. And I think to some extent releasing these documents, while it's sort of unflattering in some of the pictures, it's not a crime.
See, I'm a lawyer, right? I'm not a comms guy. But if I was advising the Trump administration, I would say you compare talk with action. There's a lot of talk from the left, particularly right now, right? What's not being revealed? What is Trump sitting on? What else is embarrassing, right? But the fact is, since 2006, which was Epstein's first guilty plea down in Florida, they have amassed all this evidence. How much action have we seen from Democrat White Houses, right? 8 years under Obama, 4 years under Joe Biden.
Zero. It was zero. Oh, no, it was zero.
No action. Who actually prosecuted Jeffrey Epstein? It was Trump's Justice Department in 2019. And then when Epstein killed himself, it was Trump's Justice Department in 2020 that prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell. So I would say, look, it's one thing you want to create this sort of fiction that I'm hiding something. Well, you don't prosecute a case if you're trying to bury it. So there's talk in the action, and the action resides with this White House.
Okay, you said that Epstein's suicide, and I don't know whether he committed suicide. I don't think it was an accident or whether it was murder. And for some reason, and I'm not a conspiracist, but the idea that Dr. Baden, there just is no better pathologist and a forensic pathologist, I think, in the country. I've worked with him for 25 years on cases at every network. and the fact that there were some glitches in the tape, that some of the surveillance tape on the cell, I mean, that just conveniently, I think it's fair to be really suspicious and wonder why can't we get a more definitive response out of what happened.
The ball was dropped. Yes, there was definitely problems with technology and there's problems with personnel in that prison. No doubt about it. And you know what? I think that's fully ripe to go into. It's within a statute of limitations, arguably, depending on what actually may have happened to him. I think it's our right to find out what anybody in the custody of the federal government, what happened to he or she. And so if it was a suicide, if it was something else, I think we deserve to know that. That's different than fishing around investigative files that go back to the 90s.
Well, one of the women from the 90s, I read, because I was thinking to myself, maybe a lot of women want this to go away. Well, apparently a lot of the women who were victims don't want to go this way. And I read over the weekend one woman who in 1996 made a complaint. I think she worked for Epstein, made a complaint about child pornography to the FBI. And I think there was some suggestion that nobody believed her until these files were released. And lo and behold, there is the complaint. There is her report in the FBI's files, in the Justice Department files. And the FBI did zero. And so she's vindicated.
I think things like that are important to shine a spotlight on. I think it shows that the system doesn't always work perfectly, and I think that's completely ripe to kind of delve into. But my takeaway from this is the only real good that can come from this is if it uncovers additional charges that can be brought against individuals. And the fact is, the vast majority of this is beyond the statute of limitations, even for child trafficking, which has no statute of limitations up to 2002. Anything before 2002 is still off the table. So I think, again, it's sensational. Maybe it will sate the appetite of people who are conspiracy theorists and just want to know more. But at the end of the day, my fear is this back and forth about what is and is not being revealed is just going to keep going. And people will never be completely satisfied.
All right, so that's the legal answer. What about the political answer? Like maybe somebody doesn't want to vote for someone who hangs around with creepy people or sits in a hot tub as President Clinton did in a hot tub with some woman that they blacked out, so naturally we assume it wasn't Hillary.
But we knew that already. We didn't need the Justice Department to tell us that, right? That's different between, I think, the journalists uncovering it or individuals revealing it versus the government telling us that. I don't think that it's the job of the FBI.
Well, look at
a
lot we're not being told. Look at the redaction on the screen. Those are pages that have been released. That's pretty. I mean, it's not as though the Justice Department is giving us a lot of stuff. They're not showing us a lot of stuff.
There's 5 categories of permitted redactions, right, in the Epstein Act that Congress just passed. And believe me, as a person who spent years at law firms, it's not as easy as one might think to go through very carefully through documents and mark potential redactions and then have a second level of supervisory review look at those transactions, look at those documents and those redactions, and then have to prepare a report to Congress about why that information was redacted. So I think all this talk about why this deadline of last Friday wasn't met, I think it's hard.
I think, no. They gained that deadline. I mean, I thought the Justice Department was smart in, releasing what they could, and now they're just keep releasing it.
It was never realistic.
Anyway, Joseph Moreno, thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Greta.